During the Viking Age, 500,000 women disappeared into silence. Not into legend, not into the sagas, but into markets, coffles, and graves. Their absence is the price of Viking glory. Ships that we celebrate in museums were not just vessels of exploration. They were floating prisons, their hulls soaked in salt sweat and blood. Who truly bore the cost of Norse triumphs? Not the warriors whose names echo in sagas, but the women whose names were erased. Chronicles record victories. Bones and DNA record the debt. If you value the historical record, subscribe, because when the ledger closes, the bones still speak. But let us begin not in a saga hall, but in a tent by the Volga River, the year 922. A young slave girl, perhaps 19, is chosen to follow her master into the afterlife. Ibn Fadlan, an Arab envoy, watches through the tent's thin fabric. He cannot hear all, but he sees shadows. 6 warriors filing in, one after another, before the angel of death enters with rope and blade. The girl is named nowhere in his manuscript. To history, she is smoke. Yet for 10 days, she lived in a twilight state, fed, intoxicated, rehearsed for her own ritual murder. She is our first witness. Not because she speaks, she barely can, but because her silence opens the question at the heart of this story. Was this brutality an aberration of barbarism, or was it the architecture of Viking power itself? This is not the Viking story you were told. It is the one they tried to bury. The dawn of June 8th, 793, broke quiet over the island of Lindisfarne. The holy chants inside the monastery had barely faded when the sea delivered something no hymn could ward off. Longships cutting across the tide, their prows like sharpened teeth. For centuries, chroniclers would describe this day as the opening of the Viking Age, but they rarely described what happened to the women. Through the grain stores, Sister Aldred pressed herself into the dust lungs burning as Norse voices came closer. She had been illuminating manuscripts an hour earlier, her quill scratching the words of the Psalms. Now she listened to screams inside the church, the tearing of wood, the collision of iron on bone. When they found her, she was dragged out by her hair into the blinding sun. All around her, women were being separated from the rest. Mothers pulled from their children, nuns from their altars. The sorting began with terrifying efficiency. The Vikings moved among the captives like merchants, among cattle, their eyes trained to read bodies as ledgers. Beauty was noted muscle-weighed age, calculated by teeth. Aldred's friend Brigid, with her auburn hair that glowed like fire in the morning light, was placed among the special use women. An older nun, with hands calloused from years of farm work, was shoved toward the laborer group. The youngest girls, barely into adolescence, were marked for breeding. Those too old or infirm to be profitable were struck down where they stood, their bodies left for the crows. This was not chaos. It was system. Violence became sorting, and sorting became economy. What looked like savagery was actually logistics, a human harvest practiced to perfection. The monastery's treasures, chalices, reliquaries, illuminated texts were valuable, yes. But the true prophet walked on 2 legs, weeping and bleeding, herded like livestock toward the beach where the longships waited. Brigid resisted thrashing, crying for the virgin. Her captor laughed and shoved her into the mud. To him, her beauty was not a gift from God, but a price point, a premium for resale in Dublin or Hedeby. Aldred, less striking, was shoved toward the farmer's pile, destined for decades of grinding grain until her back bent and her fingers twisted like roots. In those first moments of captivity, the future of each woman was decided with the same indifference used to sort livestock at a market. Here, the Vikings revealed their genius, not in poetry, not in battle tactics, but in commodification. Every raid was a transaction in waiting. Every captive woman a unit of currency. The division on Lindisfarne's beach foreshadowed centuries of systemic cruelty. The Vikings did not simply take women, they placed them into categories, value bands, logistical streams. It was violence industrialized. Chronicles written later spoke vaguely of many were carried off, but the lived reality was closer to an auction yard. Those selected for special purposes faced grooming resale and exploitation in halls or foreign markets. The breeders were forced into cycles of reproduction that turned wombs into factories of labor. The laborers became tools until their bodies broke. Each category was a death sentence differing only in the timetable. And yet, the genius of this cruelty was its normalization. The men on those beaches did not see themselves as butchers. They saw themselves as traders, investors, harvesters of opportunity. Violence was not an act of passion, it was infrastructure. Aldred was marched toward the ships, shackled with a dozen others. Behind her, the monastery smoldered, its library burning. But the true fire was lit in the system that carried her across the sea. In the belly of the longship crammed with women, the future of Viking wealth was secured. Grain stores could rot. Gold could be lost at sea. But human bodies multiplied themselves through labor, through children, through resale. The raid on Lindisfarne was not an isolated horror. It was a template. What unfolded that morning, the sorting, the selection, the slaughter of the useless, would repeat for 3 centuries across the coasts of Europe. The Vikings had discovered that fear emptied villages faster than fire, but it was women who turned raids into long-term profit. Their suffering became the engine of expansion. What began on Lindisfarne's beach was not merely the humiliation of nuns, but the institutional birth of a system. A system that measured women as capital, categorized them as assets, and turned the violation of bodies into economic logic. And this raises the central unresolved question. When a civilization builds its wealth on such foundations, can its glory be separated from its crimes? The marketplace will provide the next answer. For if Lindisfarne showed the capture, Dublin revealed the machinery auction blocks feeding pens numbers painted on flesh. And there the commodification of women reached industrial scale. Dublin today is a European capital, full of glass offices and Georgian squares. But from 841 until 1170, it was something else entirely. The western headquarters of the largest human trafficking operation Europe had ever seen. Beneath its cobbled streets lie the foundations of pens, where women were held auction blocks, where their bodies were catalogued, and ledgers, where their value was calculated in silver. Imagine walking into Dublin's market square in the year 852. The wooden platform stands 15 feet high, so every bidder can see the merchandise. A woman, her name already stripped away, is pushed into the light. Her hair has been brushed, her face washed, her body examined for marks of pregnancy or illness. She stands naked as the auctioneer lists her qualities in 4 languages: Norse for the raiders, Latin for the churchmen, Greek for Byzantine buyers, and Arabic for the merchants who will carry her east. Bids rise quickly. A Frankish noblewoman commands 20 marks, her virginity shouted, as a selling point. A mother of 3 brings only 8. Her value lies in labour, not allure. A girl of 14 fetches more than both combined her youth, making her multipliable a body that will produce more bodies. The hammer falls. She is led away in chains, her life converted into silver coin that will fund the next raid, the next ship, the next market day. This was no chaotic bazaar. It was organized with a precision that would make any modern bureaucrat proud. Feeding stations provided just enough sustenance to keep women alive without cutting into profit margins. Medical inspectors separated the sick from the healthy, not for mercy, but to preserve the value of the stock. Numbers were painted in ink across shoulders identifiers that reduced flesh to inventory. The pens could hold up to 500 women at a time. Slavic captives from the east stood beside Irish villagers, Frankish nuns beside Anglo-Saxon mothers. Ethnic identity determined price. Slavs fetched premiums in Byzantine markets. Irish women were preferred in Iceland. Frankish women commanded attention from Moorish buyers. The categories created on beaches like Lindisfarne now intersected with global economics. Behind the spectacle logistics ruled. Ships arrived weekly during trading season, each carrying dozens of captives. Some women had already been sold 3, 4, even 10 times before arriving here, shuffled like coinage across the Norse world. A woman's journey might begin in Northumbria, pass through Dublin, continue to Hedeby, in Denmark, and end in Baghdad. Each transfer extracted more profit. Every sale meant another act of violence, another layer of erasure. The records that survive are chilling in their banality. Ledgers list women not as persons, but as commodities. One Irish girl, aged 16, skilled in weaving 15 marks. Frankish widow, literate, able to read Latin, 30 marks. A skilled scribe could fetch more than a sack of silver, not because her mind mattered, but because her labor could be monetized for years. The Vikings had discovered what later empires would refine knowledge like beauty could be enslaved. What strikes hardest is not the brutality, but the normalization. Auctioneers joked, buyers haggled, children played at the edge of the square eating scraps while women screamed on the block. The entire city lived off this trade. Inns hosted foreign buyers. Blacksmiths made shackles. Boatwrights built hulls with reinforced holds for human cargo. Dublin was not just a market, it was an ecosystem built on human flesh. And for every woman sold, hundreds more were terrified into silence across Europe. News of Dublin's auctions spread through monasteries and villages. Families fled before raiders arrived, abandoning farms and food stores. But those who were captured became part of the machinery transformed from daughters and mothers into commodities. One case survives in fragmentary records or Leith, a young Irish noblewoman auctioned in Dublin around 870. Chroniclers mention her as the girl with red hair. She was sold for 24 marks to a Byzantine merchant. Her fate disappears into the labyrinth of Mediterranean markets. But her price appears again in a ledger, 24 marks, that funded weapons for another raid. In other words, her body became a weapon against the next village. This is the true genius of the system. Suffering was not incidental, it was reinvested. Every scream on the block echoed forward into the next conquest. Pain became capital. Standing in Dublin's market, it becomes impossible to separate Viking glory from this foundation. The longships, the sagas, the raids, all were underwritten by the sale of women. Without the auctions, there is no expansion. Without the pens, there is no wealth. Without the silence of the victims, there is no story left to tell. And yet, a question remains. Was this horror an unfortunate byproduct of conquest, or the actual heart of Viking economics? To answer, we must follow the silver beyond Dublin, trace the roots to Hedeby, Novgorod, Constantinople, Baghdad. Only then do we see that slavery was not excess. It was the economy itself. The myth of the Vikings often tells us they were raiders, first traders second. But the ledgers tell another story. Raiding provided the fuel, slavery provided the fire. Spoils of battle could be spent once. Human bodies could be spent again and again, laboured bread resold, and converted into wealth across continents. The Dublin auction block was only the beginning. From there, women entered a network so vast it rivaled the trade in silver or grain. Hedeby in Denmark acted as the northern hub, connecting raiders from the British Isles with traders bound for the Baltic and beyond. Novgorod funneled Slavic captives south. Constantinople became a magnet for high-value slaves, scribes, musicians, concubines. Baghdad demanded women with pale skin and red hair marketed as exotic treasures. Each woman was evaluated as if she were a coin stamped with a set of qualities that determined value. A virgin between 14 and 18 might command 20 marks of silver, not because she was human, but because she represented potential profit streams, years of use, the capacity to bear children who themselves became slaves, and resale value that could double in a decade. A woman with visible pregnancy carried a strange price premium. Buyers called it proof of fertility. Her womb was already producing another slave, an additional unit of property. 2 lives for 1 purchase. She might be bid up to 15 or even 20 marks less for her body's autonomy than for its multiplication capacity. Skill magnified value further. A woman who could weave might be worth 3 times as much as one who couldn't. A literate nun able to read and copy Latin might fetch 30 marks in Byzantine markets desperate for scribes. A healer with knowledge of herbs could command a small fortune for chieftains who understood that her skills might extend their lives. The irony is suffocating. What was once vocation or devotion became a sales pitch. Even age had its logic. Older women rarely fetched high prices, but their bodies could still be made profitable. They were sold to farms in Iceland or Greenland, where endurance mattered more than beauty. They would grind grain, carry timber, or herd animals until collapse. When their bodies finally failed, their deaths were not mourned, but recorded as property losses, no different from oxen that had outlived usefulness. This economy of violence extended into financial innovation. Credit systems emerged. A merchant might purchase 20 women in Dublin on borrowed silver, expecting to resell them in Baghdad for double the price. Insurance practices developed to offset the risk of deaths at sea. Partnerships pooled resources to invest in large shipments. The Vikings, often caricatured as wild marauders, were also financial engineers. They understood supply chains centuries before the term existed. The reach was staggering. A girl captured in an English village might pass through 5 different hands before her final destination. Each transaction added value to the system, even as it destroyed her life. A Welsh woman named Branwen appears fleetingly in records sold 16 times in 2 years. She travelled from Ireland to Denmark to Sweden before vanishing into the east. Every sale generated profit. Every mile erased her identity further. And yet the deeper cruelty lies not in the brutality itself, but in its normalization as policy. Slavery wasn't a side effect of Viking power. It was its beating heart. Archaeological digs in Dublin, Hedeby and Birka show shackles, iron collars and holding pens designed with industrial scale in mind. These were not improvisations. They were infrastructure. Contemporary poetry and sagas, when they mention these women at all, reduce them to background. A thrall pouring mead at a feast. A concubine glimpsed in passing. Their individuality erased so thoroughly that only the economic shadow remains. But that shadow is vast enough to reveal the truth. Viking wealth did not come from raiding monasteries. It came from processing human beings as currency. The numbers speak louder than myth. A single raid might produce a few sacks of silver and gold, but dozens of captives. Over a lifetime, those captives generated wealth hundreds of times greater than loot alone. Their labor built farms in Iceland, fueled textile production, filled the halls of nobles, and fed the insatiable market stretching from Scandinavia to the Middle East. This was not random violence. It was industrial cruelty. The Vikings had built an economy where human suffering was the principal resource. Every body was a coin, every womb a mint, every scream a transaction. And yet, a haunting question lingers. How do you legislate such a system? When does brutality stop being a matter of conquest and become a matter of law? The answer lies not in the markets of Dublin, but in the law codes of Iceland, where violence was given. The dignity of legal language and women's humanity was erased with bureaucratic precision. If the markets turned women into merchandise, the law turned them into ledgers. Violence became not just tolerated, but codified, written into the bones of Iceland's earliest lawbook, the Gragas. Its clauses recited aloud at assemblies in the windswept valley of Thingvellir, read like accounts not of human lives, but of livestock management. One passage explains that the killing of an enslaved woman was not murder. It was damage. Like a sheep lost in a storm or a horse broken on rocks, her death carried only one consequence: financial compensation to her owner. The amount depended on her age, her skills, her reproductive capacity. A 20-year-old woman who could weave fetched more in death than a 30-year-old who couldn't. The law reduced her existence to a line-item replacement value 8 marks of silver. That was all her life was worth. A case from the 10th century makes the abstraction real. A woman named Asa, captured in Ireland and enslaved in Iceland for 5 years, died when Thorstein Redbeard struck his neighbour with an axe during a land dispute. Asa was caught between them, her ribs shattered. The assembly's judgment was simple. Thorstein owed her master 8 marks. No punishment for her death. No acknowledgement of her humanity. Only reimbursement. She vanished from law and memory simultaneously. Gragas did more than price lives. It engineered obedience by regulating bodies. One clause established the morning gift tradition, allowing a master to lend a woman to guests as casually as offering bread or ale. The law treated her body as hospitality, something that could be consumed and returned. Refusal was legally impossible. She was in the coldest sense a transferable utility. Another provision addressed injury. If, an enslaved woman was harmed by anyone other than her master, compensation again went not to her, but to the master. A broken arm meant lost labor value, not personal suffering. If the injury reduced her reproductive capacity, the compensation adjusted accordingly. The arithmetic was clinical. Pain was invisible, but productivity was measurable. So productivity was all the law cared to preserve. The most chilling rule was hereditary bondage. Children inherited their mother's status, no exceptions. Freedom could not be transmitted through the father's blood, even if he was noble. A child born of an enslaved mother and a free father was a thrall. The principle was brutally efficient. Every womb became a factory of permanence. Women carried not just their chains, but their children's. Enslavement replicated itself biologically, erasing any possibility of natural extinction. There were loopholes, but they were crueler than the chains themselves. A provision suggested that if a woman bore 3 children who survived to adulthood, she could theoretically earn freedom. In practice, it was nearly impossible. Infant mortality exceeded 50%. Work during pregnancy destroyed bodies. Masters rarely honored the promise. Across generations of records, only a handful of women were ever freed this way. Most died trying their children inheriting not freedom, but another cycle of despair. Gragas stripped even the vocabulary of resistance. A thrall could not testify in court. She could not inherit property. She could not seek vengeance for wrongs committed against her. Legally, she did not exist as a person. Her presence in the law was only a shadow tethered entirely to her owner. The law's bureaucratic precision reveals the philosophical heart of Viking power. This was not chaos or excess. It was system. It was cruelty, rationalized, spoken aloud in assembly, as though fairness demanded women be catalogued alongside cattle. The sagas celebrate the law speaker standing on the law rock, reciting passages from memory to a gathered crowd. They present this ritual as evidence of a society governed by order, not by whim. But what order was this? An order where the worth of a woman was calculated in silver, where her body could be passed between men as custom, where her children were condemned before they could speak. Imagine standing in that valley, hearing those words. Free men listening, nodding, agreeing that such rules maintained stability. Behind them, enslaved women grinding grain, herding animals, carrying infants destined to inherit their mother's status. The law rock proclaimed justice, but in practice it proclaimed ownership. And beneath that ownership lurked a deeper question: if law could erase humanity so thoroughly, what else might it erase? If words could reduce women to property, could the same words erase memory, history, even dissent? Gragas wasn't only a code of rules, it was a blueprint for forgetting. The answer lay not only in clauses and judgments, but in the way power used marriage itself as a weapon. Forced unions between conquerors and their captives blurred the line between violence and legitimacy, transforming rape into lineage and conquest into genealogy. If the marketplace sold women as livestock and the law erased them as property, then marriage completed the conquest. In Viking hands, the ceremony of union, traditionally a bond of kinship, became an act of domination. It was not about joining families, but about erasing them. Consider the story of Brianna, daughter of an Irish chieftain. 3 days after Vikings stormed her family's fortress, she stood in her mother's blood-stained wedding dress, forced to marry the man who had severed her father's head. Everyone in the hall understood. The symbolism, the bloodline of her people had been consumed. What looked like a marriage feast was actually a funeral for a kingdom. The law recognized it, the saga writers praised it, and her body sealed it. This was not exceptional. Across Scotland, Ireland, Francia and Saxony, noble daughters became instruments of genetic colonization. When local resistance failed, conquerors turned women into bridges between the dead past and a Viking future. Each child born of these coerced unions embodied conquest. Their faces carried their mother's lineage, but their loyalty language and gods belonged to their fathers. Archaeology and genetics confirm what sagas leave unsaid. Modern Icelandic DNA studies reveal the asymmetry. While 62% of the male line is Norse, 63% of the female line is Celtic, mostly Irish and Scottish. That statistic is not heritage. It is a ledger of abduction and forced marriage. It tells us that Viking expansion was not just a story of ships and steel, but of wombs turned into battlefields. For the conquerors, this strategy solved two problems at once. First, it extinguished rival bloodlines. A kingdom whose daughters bore the children of its enemies could not resurrect itself. Second, it provided political legitimacy. A Viking who married a local princess did not appear merely as an invader, he appeared as a ruler by right of blood. Her body legalized his conquest. The sagas romanticize these unions, portraying women as willingly joining their conquerors. But the truth is visible in the silences, in the absence of their own voices, in the whispered stories of women who taught their children forbidden languages or sang lullabies of a homeland they could never see again. Marriage became a prison disguised as a ritual, where the chains were woven not of iron, but of kinship itself. Imagine the psychological violence. A woman sits at the feasting table beside the man who butchered her brothers. Servants once her family's retainers now serve him. Her belly swells with a child who will inherit the lands stolen from her kin. She smiles on command because if she falters, her suffering will be used as leverage against her people. Her body has become hostage, her survival tied to their submission. And yet, within this horror, acts of resistance flickered. Some women preserved genealogies, in secret songs embedding names of slain fathers and uncles into lullabies disguised as harmless rhymes. Others passed down fragments of their original tongues, teaching children to count or pray in Irish Saxon or Frankish. Some plotted revenge patiently, like Gudrun of the Hebrides, who spent 10 years playing the loyal wife before poisoning her husband with mushrooms she had carefully prepared. But such defiance was rare. Most endured. The system was self-reinforcing. Every child born from these marriages blurred loyalties further. Local populations faced with rulers who carried their blood but bore Viking allegiance found resistance psychologically fractured. To fight the conqueror meant to fight kin, and that confusion eroded the possibility of rebellion. Conquest had moved from battlefield to bedroom, from sword to lineage. The strategy's success echoes through centuries. Modern Scandinavian populations are living proof of this biological weapon. Their male ancestry remains overwhelmingly Norse, but their female ancestry tells the story of captive brides, of forced alliances written into the DNA of nations. It is the deepest scar one carved into genetics itself. But here lies the governing open loop. If marriage, this most sacred of social bonds, could be transformed into conquest, what did that mean for the very definition of civilization? Was Viking glory a triumph of culture, or simply the industrialization of women's suffering? The answer, grim as it is, would emerge in the next generation, when captivity no longer needed battles to sustain it. By then, slavery was not just an act of raiding or marriage, it was inheritance. If raids and forced marriages were brutal, what came after was worse. The true genius and horror of the Viking system was not the moment of capture, not even the humiliation of forced unions. It was inheritance. Slavery became hereditary, passed through the womb. What began as a raid became a dynasty of chains. Imagine 3 women standing in the same Icelandic household around the year 960. Grandmother, mother, and granddaughter. The grandmother had been captured in Scotland, dragged screaming from the coast as her village burned. She could still remember freedom, the taste of oat bread baked in her family's home, the songs sung in Gaelic at night, the freedom to walk across fields without permission. She carried these memories like relics, treasures she whispered to her children, so they would know they had not always been property. Her daughter, however, was born into slavery. She had never seen freedom. For her, her mother's stories felt like myths, half believed, half forgotten. She understood conceptually that she was descended from free people, but she had no frame of reference. Her entire life was labor grinding grain, weaving wool-bearing children for a master who would sell them as soon as they could work. Her identity was neither free nor fully enslaved. It was survival suspended in a limbo where hope meant pain. And then there was the granddaughter. She could not even imagine freedom. Her grandmother's stories were fairy tales. Her mother's survival strategies were reality. She had no concept of herself as a person outside ownership. She did not think of herself as someone enslaved. She thought of herself as a slave. The transformation was complete. Freedom had vanished not only from her body, but from her imagination. This generational chain was more powerful than any iron. Violence at the moment of capture could be resisted, defied, endured. But when captivity became identity, resistance collapsed before it could even form. The granddaughter grew up knowing her daughters would suffer the same fate. Slavery had become a bloodline. The sagas rarely mention these women, except in passing, but archaeology fills in the silences. Graves in Iceland show women buried with tools of labor spindles, weaving weights, grinding stones rather than jewelry or weapons. These objects were not symbols of honor. They were the instruments of their bondage, buried with them, as if their identity as workers could not be severed even in death. Their lives had been reduced to labor so thoroughly that even their graves carried no other story. Modern science offers another window trauma passed through generations. Epigenetic studies show that severe stress can alter gene expression, leaving chemical marks that affect descendants. Children of famine survivors inherit bodies primed for scarcity. Children of war survivors inherit nervous systems tuned to fear. It is not hard to imagine the enslaved women of the Viking world leaving such imprints on their bloodlines. The hypervigilance, the numbness, the learned silence, these became survival traits etched into biology itself. But the brutality was not only biological, it was legal. Gragas made hereditary bondage explicit. The child of a thrall woman was a thrall regardless of the father's status. Even if a free man wanted to claim his child, he could not. The law denied paternal lineage entirely. The mother's womb determined destiny, and that destiny was bondage. A free father could love, could even grieve, but he could not liberate. The law ensured that every generation replenished the system, feeding new bodies into old chains. The cycle created grotesque paradoxes. A child might grow up in the same household as his free father, even serve him food, but remain legally property. A daughter might be sold to strangers while her half-brothers inherited land. The family became a site of both intimacy and betrayal, where blood meant nothing against law. And yet, within these households, culture flickered. The grandmother might still sing in Gaelic. The mother might still whisper Irish prayers. The granddaughter might still learn words of a language she would never use in public. These fragments of memory survived like embers beneath ash. They were not resistance in the military sense, but they preserved identity against total erasure. What made this system so devastating was not its violence, but its permanence. Wars end, raids cease. But hereditary slavery guaranteed that suffering reproduced itself endlessly, with each generation born into a prison they could neither see nor escape. The grandmother dreamed of freedom. The mother doubted it. The granddaughter could not even imagine it. That is victory for power, not only to chain the body, but to colonize the mind. But here lies the question that should trouble us still. When a society builds its wealth on erasure, so complete that even memory cannot survive, can its glory be called civilization? Or is it only conquest stretched across generations? The answer would become clearer when we consider geography itself, not just law, not just lineage, but the land that turned escape into impossibility. When we think of slavery, we often imagine chains, whips, and overseers. But in the Viking world, one of the strongest tools of control was not forged by human hands. It was the land itself. Iceland and Greenland, so often celebrated in sagas as wild frontiers, were in truth natural prisons. For enslaved women, these islands did not just contain them, they annihilated hope itself. Picture an enslaved woman in Iceland around the year 930. She has endured the violence of capture, survived the journey across the sea, and now labors on a farm carved from volcanic soil. One night, she flees. Perhaps she has stolen a piece of bread, perhaps a knife. She walks across jagged lava fields until her feet bleed, climbs rocky ridges until her hands tear, and finally reaches the coast. There, the horizon stretches endlessly, a silver blue wall of ocean. She realizes the truth. The island is a cage without bars. Freedom is not across the hills, but across a sea she cannot cross. Geography has already judged her guilty, and the sentence is life without escape. The sagas themselves record such futility. In one case, 23 thralls attempted a mass escape in 912, coordinating across farms to steal boats. They reached the coast, even launched vessels, but none survived. Weeks later, wreckage washed back onto Iceland's southern shore, the sea delivering its verdict: no slave would outrun its waves. For their masters, the disaster was confirmation. Escape was not a danger that required constant policing. The land itself did the policing for them. Those who tried and failed faced punishments calculated not for vengeance, but for deterrence. Death was too final. mutilation was more useful. A common sentence for runaways was hobbling the cutting of the Achilles tendons. The wounds would heal, but never correctly. The woman could still work in fields, still grind grain, still bear children, but she would never run again. Every step became a shuffle. Every movement a reminder carved into her body that escape was impossible. In a small community, such shuffling gaits became silent lessons for others. The geography made escape unlikely. Mutilation made the thought of it unbearable. Even suicide became an act shaped by the land. Iceland's hot springs and volcanoes offered desperate women a form of release their masters could not control. Some walked directly into boiling water, choosing scalding death over another day of ownership. Others hurled themselves into lava flows, becoming ash in seconds. The volcano Hekla later feared as a gateway to hell in medieval Christian imagination was already known as a place where desperate thralls ended their lives. For masters, this was both a loss and a grim convenience. A body destroyed by fire could not inspire rebellion. Geography offered escape only in death. Greenland, settled later, made Iceland look merciful. The settlements there were few and fragile, clinging to narrow strips of habitable coastline between glaciers and mountains. For enslaved women, the landscape was absolute despair. The seas were colder, the distances greater, the winters longer. No forests offered cover. No nearby lands promised sanctuary. To flee into Greenland's interior was to choose starvation or freezing death. Polar bears, not human guards, enforced captivity. Worse still, the gender imbalance in Greenland was extreme. Free men vastly outnumbered free women. That imbalance condemned enslaved women to communal exploitation. They were not merely property of a single master, but resources circulated among men, their bodies serving as tools of survival in an environment where every settler depended on others. Law, such as it existed, broke down in these tiny communities. Violence required no justification. A woman could be killed for no reason. Her body discarded on the ice, her existence erased as easily as footprints in snow. Archaeology and law reinforce the bleak picture. Gragas mentions that runaway thralls in Iceland could be hunted like animals with legal protections for their captors. Skeletons found near farm sites sometimes show blunt force trauma to legs, evidence of hobbling, and shallow graves without markers suggesting deaths without mourning. These remains tell stories. The sagas chose not to record stories of women who ran, were caught, and were punished into silence. Geography weaponized the imagination itself. In continental slavery systems, at least the idea of escape remained. Perhaps freedom lay across the next border in the next city with sympathetic allies. In Iceland and Greenland, the enslaved did not even have that fantasy. To dream of freedom was to dream of drowning, freezing, or starving. The ocean erased hope before it could take root. A woman who dared to run knew her odds of success were less than a shadow's. This is power at its most insidious. Not the lash across the back, not the guard at the gate, but the crushing certainty that there is nowhere to go. When captivity becomes geography itself, rebellion dies before it begins. And so the islands celebrated in Norse myth as worlds of discovery became in reality the most perfect prisons imaginable. Yet, this perfection of control raises a question. If even the land was weaponized into governance, what happened when fear itself was turned into a tool? What if the Vikings discovered they could conquer entire regions, not just with chains and oceans, but with stories? Not every conquest requires a battle. Sometimes the most devastating weapon is not the axe, but the story of the axe. The Vikings understood this with precision. They built an empire not only on ships and steel, but on reputation. The spectacle of women's suffering when deliberately displayed carefully circulated became a propaganda machine that could empty entire villages before a single warrior arrived. Consider York in 866, when the great heathen army seized the city. Instead of marching immediately into new campaigns, the Vikings waited. They let the stories spread. Refugees carried tales of wives dragged through streets of noble daughters, displayed before jeering soldiers of churches turned into brothels. By the time Viking columns advanced again, resistance had evaporated. Entire villages fled at the sound of approaching ships. The Vikings had discovered that one atrocity could purchase 10 bloodless victories. The psychological calculus was ruthless. When women were paraded through conquered towns, hair shorn, clothes torn, bodies marked by violence, it was not random cruelty, it was theatre. Fathers forced to watch daughters, violated husbands, forced to watch wives enslaved, were not only humiliated in that moment, they became living advertisements of impotence. Their shattered dignity carried the message farther than any scout resistance is pointless. Submission is survival. Medieval chronicles describe this weaponization of fear in chilling detail. After the sack of Rouen, Norman annals record how neighbouring counties emptied before the Vikings even arrived. Families packed carts, abandoned farms, and left entire landscapes ghostly quiet. What sword could have achieved this efficiency? None. But the memory of violated women did. Economically, terror was brilliant policy. Fighting consumed warriors risked lives, drained resources. Terror required only a handful of carefully orchestrated spectacles. Release one survivor with the right scars, and you could move armies without moving them. It was logistics of fear. Fewer dead Vikings, more abandoned farms, greater profits. The tactic reached a kind of perfection when captives themselves were weaponized. Ivar the Boneless reportedly paraded noble women in chains. During negotiations, their broken forms speaking louder than any envoy. They were human letters written in pain, carried into enemy lands as warnings of what awaited defiance. To see one of your own noble daughters displayed as spoils was not merely a tragedy, it was a prophecy. And most communities chose not to test whether it would come true. There is evidence the Vikings sometimes deliberately released captives for this purpose. A woman who had seen but survived the spectacle became the most credible messenger. Her words, trembling with lived horror, carried a weight that rumors could not. She became an unwilling herald of Viking power, her survival not mercy but strategy. Terror multiplied itself through networks. Stories whispered in monasteries traveled through pilgrim routes and trade roads. A single raid on Lindisfarne in 793 became infamous across Europe, not because of its scale, but because monks carried the tale into every scriptorium. In each retelling, the image of women dragged from sanctuaries became darker, more grotesque, until entire generations imagined Vikings as demons walking out of the sea. The exaggeration was not inaccurate. In effect, it magnified the paralysis of fear. This was not spontaneous. It was systemic. Vikings timed raids for maximum audience on feast days during markets at harvest gatherings. The greater the crowd, the wider the circle of witnesses who would later spread the tale. Terror was staged like ritual theatre. Women's bodies became the stage, the suffering the script, the survivors, the actors carrying the story onward. Here lies the deeper psychology. Terror works not by what it does to its victims, but by what it does to those who watch. It forces communities to imagine themselves in the place of the humiliated, to picture their own daughters in chains, their own wives screaming in churches. The imagination does the work of conquest before the sword arrives. And so the Vikings discovered that the greatest prison was not geography, but anticipation. Whole valleys emptied into forests, entire coastlines abandoned before longships ever landed. This weapon of stories saved them. Soldiers enriched them with unguarded treasure and allowed them to stretch their power far beyond what their numbers alone could sustain. But this raises a grim paradox. If terror could be so effective, what happened when women's resistance created stories of its own? If a poisoned feast left 12 warriors dead, if an enslaved woman struck down her master in his sleep, did that terror travel just as quickly? Did Vikings themselves begin to fear the very captives they had reduced to property? That is the next chapter in this ledger of power, when women robbed of freedom wielded defiance as their final weapon. If terror was the Vikings' most efficient weapon, then resistance, fragile, desperate, and often doomed, was the one counterblow left to the women they enslaved. Against ships and chains, their tools were poison jars, sharpened needles, smuggled embers. Against an economy of flesh, they fought with acts so small they often vanished from records, yet so haunting that even Viking sagas could not erase them completely. Take the story of Deirdre of Munster, preserved in Irish oral tradition. Captured in a coastal raid and taken as concubine to a warband leader, she served him mead for 2 years. The sagas mention her only once, describing the sudden sickness of 12 warriors who feasted on the eve of battle. Local tradition fills the silence Deirdre had laced their drink with monkshood, a poison she learned to identify as a child. The Vikings called it a curse. The Irish called it justice. Such poisonings were not isolated. Archaeological digs at Dublin's slave market have unearthed ceramic jars with residues of deadly herbs, aconite, hemlock, foxglove. Were they used by healers or by enslaved women seeking to flip the imbalance of power? The answer may be both. Medicine and murder were neighbors in the same garden. What mattered was the decision to use knowledge as a weapon. Arson, too, became an act of rebellion. One saga describes the mysterious fire that consumed a chieftain's longhouse in Iceland, killing him and 6 retainers. Officially, it was blamed on faulty hearth maintenance, but fragments of rope soaked in pitch found in the earth beneath suggest design. A slave woman with access to kindling, ignored by every eye, could alter history with a spark. Infanticide was the most tragic form of defiance. Chronicles from both Christian and Muslim sources record enslaved women drowning their newborns rather than surrendering them to a lifetime in chains. To us, it sounds unbearable. To them, it was the last control over destiny. Better no future than a future built on rape and forced labor. These women robbed their captors of property, but more than that, they robbed them of legacy. Each drowned infant was a refusal to let Viking bloodlines reproduce through conquest. Not all resistance was violent. Some was cultural, subtle, invisible. Enslaved women carried songs, prayers, and fragments of language into foreign households. Irish lullabies whispered in Icelandic barns. Gaelic prayers murmured before bed in Greenland's icy huts. Archaeologists have found combs and spindle whorls carved with Celtic designs buried in Viking farms, tokens of an identity smuggled into the next generation. Though they bore children of their captors, these women encoded rebellion in memory itself, ensuring that Celtic voices lived on even under Norse roofs. And sometimes, defiance was psychological theatre. A saga recounts a thrall woman who, during a feast, refused to eat the bread offered to her by her master. When questioned, she answered calmly, "Because it tastes of my daughter's blood." The hall fell silent. No punishment could erase the power of those words. By speaking grief aloud, she shattered the ritual of dominance, forcing everyone to look at the cost hidden in their own food. Of course, resistance rarely ended in triumph. Deirdre was executed by slow strangulation. Women who poisoned masters were burned alive. Those caught attempting infanticide were mutilated as examples. Yet punishment did not erase the fear left behind. Warriors grew cautious, suspicious of food served by trembling hands. Husbands watched their enslaved wives at night, fearing the knife hidden under straw. Even the most brutal systems cannot escape the paranoia born from resistance. And so we return to the paradox. If Viking terror was meant to silence, why do their own sagas remember whispers of women who struck back? Perhaps because silence was never total. Even in chains, voices leaped through. Even erased from ledgers, their acts haunted memory. The Vikings may have feared nothing on the battlefield, but in their own halls at their own feasts. They feared the invisible defiance of women who had nothing left to lose. Which leads to the question our story now turns toward when bloodlines themselves become the archive of conquest. When DNA rather than chronicles tells the truth. What legacy do these women leave behind? Centuries after sagas fell silent, bones and bloodlines began to speak. In Iceland, where genealogies are famously detailed, modern genetic studies have uncovered a startling asymmetry. The Y chromosomes trace overwhelmingly to Norse men, while the mitochondrial DNA, the maternal line, speaks of Ireland and Scotland. In other words, Iceland was not born of a harmonious fusion, but of abduction and enforced union. The island's very genome preserves the record of conquest. This is not abstract science. When researchers sampled mitochondrial DNA from contemporary Icelanders, they found that nearly 2/3 of maternal markers matched Celtic regions. The sagas describe voyages and alliances, but genetics tells a harsher story. Norse ships carried women who did not choose to be there. Every birth on Iceland's volcanic soil carried the echo of a raid, a market, a forced marriage. Archaeology amplifies the genetic testimony. Excavations of Dublin's slave market, the largest in medieval Europe, have revealed human remains consistent with systematic trafficking. Female skeletons show stress fractures in hips and spines, suggesting heavy labor begun in adolescence. Teeth reveal malnutrition and abrupt dietary shifts, as if girls raised in rural Ireland were thrust into foreign diets after capture. One mass grave contained young women alongside shackles and trade weights, a silent ledger of flesh converted into currency. Consider the paradox sagas exalt voyages to Constantinople, boasting of Varangian guards and silver hordes. Yet they omit the caravans of women marched through Hedeby and Burka, branded and sold like livestock. The absence is itself evidence. Where the sagas remain, proud archaeology remains grim. A spindle whorl inscribed with runes found in Sweden contains a woman's name, Melbrigda. Scholars note the name is Gaelic, not Norse. Was she a slave weaver, her identity reduced to the tool she touched? That single object found in soil restores her to history. Genetics and artifacts together compose a counter-saga, one the Vikings never intended to leave behind. Instead of Odin and Thor guiding bloodlines, it was coercion, rape, and assimilation. Instead of noble marriages, it was forced pairings between conquerors and captives. Modern Icelanders speak of proud Viking ancestry. Their very DNA insists that half their heritage comes from women who were never asked. But here lies the deeper truth. Memory does not die with silence. It mutates, hides, and resurfaces. Cultural fragments that seemed accidental, Irish melodies in Icelandic folk songs, Celtic knot motifs carved into Norse grave markers align with genetic patterns. Each fragment is a whisper. We were here. We were taken. We endured. The sagas could erase names. The markets could destroy lineages. Yet science, indifferent and patient, brings them back. A drop of blood, a shard of pottery, a tooth pulled from the earth. These become the testimony the chronicles refused to preserve. Viking glory is rewritten by the victims themselves, encoded in bone. And so the big question sharpens: were the atrocities of capture and enslavement mere excesses, or the very foundation of Viking civilization DNA leans toward the latter? Without stolen women, there is no Iceland. Without trafficked labour, no wealth flowing to Hedeby or Burka. The empire of sails and silver rests on erased mothers. But there is one more step in this reckoning. To understand not just the scale, but the philosophy of this brutality, we must look at the accounting of pain itself. How was the suffering of 500,000 women converted into wealth, legitimacy, and memory? That is the ledger we open next. The sagas end with silence. They recount voyages, battles, kings, and conversions. But not the women screaming on the decks of ships, or the daughters auctioned in Dublin yards. Yet, history does not close with ink alone. It also closes with ledgers, accounting books of trade weights and taxes. And when those ledgers are compared with the archaeology, a truth emerges so stark it cannot be ignored. Viking power was not built on plundered treasure alone. It was built on 500,000 erased women. Consider the mathematics of pain. Between the late 8th and 11th centuries, slave markets flourished at every major Viking hub: Dublin, Hedeby, Burka, York. Historians estimate that as much as 1/3 of the populations of these trading centres were enslaved. Multiply that across centuries, and the numbers rise to hundreds of thousands. The chronicles may celebrate silver hoards and ships lined with dragon heads, but the real coin was flesh. Each raid was a harvest. Each monastery or village was a field from which women were reaped, catalogued, and sold. The Viking economy did not merely tolerate this brutality, it depended on it. Raiding could enrich a chieftain, but slavery enriched an entire system. Shipbuilders, market overseers, scribes, recording prices, priests blessing transactions, all profited. To speak of Viking prosperity without slavery is to speak of a skeleton without its bones. Every silver coin in Scandinavia carries the unseen shadow of a woman whose body was treated as property. And yet the sagas transform this horror into silence. Why? Because silence is power's final weapon. To erase the names of the enslaved was to erase their humanity twice, first in life, then in memory. To leave them out of the story was to convert atrocity into normality. The Norse word for slave thrall slips into sagas as background, never foreground. They were cooks, weavers, companions. But their capture, their suffering, their annihilation, unspoken. Silence cleansed the violence into utility, but the silence cannot hold forever. Bones unearthed at Dublin show shackled ankles. Isotopes in teeth reveal childhoods in Ireland, Scotland, and even Slavic lands. Mitochondrial DNA traces maternal lines back to those regions inscribed in the very blood of Icelanders today. What sagas erased science restores? The ledger of pain is reopened not by monks or skalds, but by archaeologists with soil samples and geneticists with sequencing machines, the governing open loop. We posed at the beginning, asked, was Viking cruelty a form of purification, a ritual testing of strength, or was it a system of control? The evidence answers it was the system. Without the violence of enslavement, there is no Viking Age as we know it. The longships would have carried fewer sails, the markets fewer coins, the settlements fewer people. The entire Norse world was scaffolded on the labour, the wombs and the erasure of conquered women. So what do we do with this truth? We confront the paradox that civilization itself is often constructed not on shared triumphs, but on shared silences. Power rewrites morality by deciding who is remembered and who is erased. The sagas became national epics. The women became statistics in DNA databases. Viking grandeur was narrated. Viking atrocity was footnoted. This asymmetry is itself a philosophy of power. What is not spoken becomes what is not real. And yet memory leaks. A spindle whorl carved with a Celtic name. A skeleton with shackles fused to bone. A genome that whispers of Irish mothers in Norse children. Each fragment is a rebellion against silence. Each fragment demands we see Viking glory not as mythic conquest, but as systematic erasure. When we look at Iceland today, celebrated for its literature, democracy, and resilience, we must also see the foundation beneath women taken against their will, forced into unions that became the genetic core of a nation. To honor Icelandic achievement while ignoring this origin is to repeat the saga's silence. To acknowledge it is to finally answer the cries that sagas refused to record. The final entry in the ledger then is not silver or livestock. It is voices. Hundreds of thousands of them never written, but still speaking through bones, through blood, through absence. Viking power was never purified glory. It was control. It was erasure. And yet, erasure is never total. The bones still speak. When the ledger closes, that is the line we must remember: the bones still speak.